In the quiet embrace of a small town, where the days bled into each other with a languid familiarity, I found myself in desperate need of a change. Not the sort that comes with grand life decisions or sweeping gestures, but something as mundane and yet as essential as a new car. My old Ford, a loyal companion of many road trips and hurried commutes, had breathed its last just outside the local grocery store, leaving me stranded with a cart full of groceries and a sudden, pressing problem. So, there I was, late into the night, hunched over my laptop, the glow of the screen casting long, flickering shadows across the walls of my modest living room. Craigslist, a digital marketplace of the weird and wonderful, seemed like a natural starting point. My budget was tight, hemmed in by the constraints of a modest income and the unrelenting demands of daily life. I sifted through listings with a practiced eye, bypassing the absurdly high-priced and the suspiciously low. That's when I stumbled upon it, an ad that seemed too good to be true, a 2012 Toyota Camry in seemingly perfect condition, listed at a price that made me do a double take. My finger hovered over the mouse, skepticism wrestling with the tantalizing promise of a bargain. The photo showed a gleaming silver Camry parked in front of a nondescript garage, the kind of image you'd expect in any car ad. But it was the price that set off alarm bells in my mind, a price that screamed, deal of a lifetime or scam. I've always prided myself on being cautious, a trait born out of necessity rather than virtue. Growing up in a town where the most exciting event was the annual fall fair, I learned to find comfort in predictability, but the need for a car, coupled with a budget that wouldn't stretch to dealership prices, had me teetering on the edge of a decision I might normally avoid. With a mixture of reluctance and intrigue, I clicked on the ad. The description was sparse, a few lines noting the car's excellent condition, low mileage, and a vague reason for the sale. Moving out, need gone ASAP. The seller, identified only as Mike, had provided a phone number, but no other details. Questions buzzed in my head like restless bees. Why so cheap? What's the catch? My finger hovered over the reply button. The rational part of me argued for caution, reminding me of the horror stories I'd heard about Craigslist deals gone wrong. But the other part, the part that was tired of waiting for buses in the rain and asking friends for rides, urged me to take a chance. I crafted a brief message, expressing interest and asking for more details about the car's condition and history. Within minutes, a reply pinged back, a simple message with an invitation to view the car at a location on the outskirts of town. The address, when I looked it up, was in a part of the county I was unfamiliar with, a secluded area surrounded by dense woods. The red flags were there, waving in my face, but desperation has a way of colouring one's judgment. I told myself that it was worth a look, that I'd be cautious, that I'd take a friend with me. Yet even as I planned, a part of me knew that this was more than just a hunt for a bargain. It was a step into the unknown, a break from the monotonous safety of my life. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the shadows played their silent dance. The Camry, with its unreal price and mysterious seller, filled my thoughts. It was just a car, a means to an end, but in the quiet of the night, it felt like something more. A puzzle, a challenge, a whisper of adventure in the otherwise straightforward narrative of my life. I drifted into a fitful sleep, dreams filled with shadowy figures and hidden dangers, the echo of my own doubts and fears. And in the heart of those dreams, a silver Camry, gleaming under a pale moon, waiting in a place where the trees whispered secrets and the unknown lurked just out of sight. Morning came, with a sense of resolve. I would go, see the car, meet this Mike. Caution would be my companion, skepticism my shield. But beneath those layers of pragmatism and fear, a spark of curiosity had been ignited, a flicker of excitement at the prospect of stepping outside the lines, if only for a moment. As I prepared for the day, the town around me stirred to life. The sun rose lazily over the rooftops, casting a warm glow on the quiet streets. It was a town that held no surprises, a place where secrets were scarce and life moved with predictable rhythm. And yet, as I set out towards the unknown, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind, stepping out of the light and into the shadows, where the lines between reality and illusion blurred, and every decision held the weight of a story yet to be told. The morning light had barely crept through the blinds when I reached for my phone, a tangible sense of purpose mingling with the remnants of my unease. Today, I would meet Mike, the enigmatic seller of the Toyota Camry that had so unexpectedly punctuated my otherwise uneventful life. I dialed the number provided in the ad, the digits a familiar mantra as I rehearsed my questions. The phone rang, each tone echoing in the stillness of my kitchen. After what seemed like an eternity, the line clicked and a voice emerged coloured with a warmth that felt disarming.
Hello?
The voice was casual, almost friendly, the tone of someone who had nothing to hide.
Hi, I'm calling about the Camry you listed on Craigslist.
I said, my voice steady, despite the fluttering in my stomach.
Ah, yes. I'm glad you called. I was hoping to get it sold quickly. You're interested?
His words were cordial, but there was an underlying haste to them, a subtle urgency that seemed out of place. I found myself being drawn into the conversation, my initial reservations melting into the background as we discussed the car. Mike described the Camry with an air of nonchalance, as though selling a car at such a suspiciously low price was the most natural thing in the world. I pressed for details, for any sign of the catch I was convinced must exist, but Mike deflected my inquiries with the skill of a seasoned salesman, providing just enough information to keep my interest piqued, without revealing anything substantial. He mentioned that he was moving out of state soon, which was why he was selling the car so cheaply and urgently.
Can I come to see it today?
I asked, my skepticism taking a backseat to the growing excitement at the prospect of finally replacing my old Ford.
Absolutely.
He replied, almost too quickly.
But I'm not in town right now. I'm at my property outside the city. It's a bit out of the way, but I can send you the address.
A flicker of apprehension danced through me. The idea of meeting a stranger at a remote location for a transaction was the kind of scenario that often began cautionary tales. But then, the allure of the deal, the image of the sleek Camry, clouded my judgment.
Sure, send me the address. I'll be there.
As I hung up, a part of me screamed in protest, warning me of the myriad of things that could go wrong. But the larger part, the part driven by need and the seductive lure of a good deal, silenced the doubts. I was being careful, I reasoned. I would tell a friend where I was going, and I would leave at the first sign of trouble. The address arrived via text, a string of numbers and letters that mapped the next step of my journey. It was located on the outskirts of the county, in an area known more for its sprawling forests and winding dirt roads than for residential properties. The remoteness of the location sent another ripple of unease through me, but the day was young, the sun was bright, and the promise of a new car beckoned like a beacon. I spent the morning in a haze of anticipation, my routines a backdrop to the unfolding adventure. I told my neighbour, Mrs. Henderson, where I was going, watching her brows knit together in concern. She cautioned me about the dangers of meeting strangers from the internet, her words a reflection of my own suppressed fears.
Be careful,
She said, her eyes sharp with the kind of worry that comes with age and wisdom.
not everyone is who they say they are.
I nodded, her words a weight in my chest, but the die had been cast. I was going, and nothing short of an outright disaster would stop me. The Uber ride to the property was longer than I expected. The town gave way to open countryside, the roads less travelled and more isolated. With each mile, civilization seemed to recede, leaving me enveloped in a world of green and brown, the forests, a silent witness to my journey. As the driver announced my nearing the destination, the paved road turned to gravel, the crunching sound beneath the tyres a stark reminder of how far I had ventured from the familiar. The houses were few and far between, the spaces between them growing wider, the sense of isolation more pronounced. When I finally turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to Mike's property, a shiver ran down my spine. The trees loomed tall on either side, their branches a tangled canopy that dimmed the sunlight. The road was uneven, riddled with potholes and overgrown with weeds, as if it hadn't seen frequent use. It was obvious the Uber driver was not thrilled about the dirt road.
Sorry about the road,
I said. I exited at the edge of a clearing, the supposed location, according to my GPS. There was no house in sight, just an expanse of wild grass and the dense wall of the forest. I stepped out of the car, the silence of the place enveloping me like a thick blanket. There was no sign of Mike, no sign of any car, just the whispering of the trees and a growing sense of unease. Had I made a mistake? Was this some elaborate prank, or worse, a trap? The rational part of me screamed to get back in the car, to go back home, away from this secluded spot, and forget the whole thing. But then, a small, stubborn part of me resisted, driven by the need to see this through, to not let my fears dictate my actions. So, I thanked my driver, gave him a big, generous tip, and waited. As the driver left, I stood there alone, listening to the rustling leaves and the distant call of a bird, the sound eerily out of place in the heavy stillness. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last, the anticipation a tight knot in my stomach. I walked to the edge of the clearing, peering into the trees, looking for any sign of a path or a building. But there was nothing, just the unbroken wall of the forest. I checked my phone again, but it was as dead as before, a useless piece of technology in my hand. I was about to call out, to announce my presence, when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps approaching from the direction I had come. I turned, my heart quickening, ready to face whoever or whatever was coming. In that moment, standing alone in the clearing, the sun sinking behind the trees and the shadows growing longer around me, I felt a frisson of fear, a premonition of something impending, something that lay just beyond the edge of understanding. It was a feeling as old as time, the primal awareness of being a small, vulnerable creature in a vast, indifferent world. And as the footsteps drew nearer, I braced myself, not just for a meeting with a stranger, but for an encounter with the unknown, with the hidden truths that lay waiting in the heart of the forest. As the sound of the footsteps grew louder, a figure slowly emerged from the tree line, casting a long, ominous shadow that stretched across the ground like a dark harbinger. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a drum of primal alert. But as the figure stepped into the clearing, I saw that it was just a man. He was average in height, with a lean build, and wore a hoodie over a plaid shirt and worn jeans. His face was partially obscured by his hoodie, but his eyes, dark and penetrating, fixed on me with an unsettling intensity.
Hi, You must be here for the Camry.
he said, his voice calm and even. I nodded, trying to mask the unease that his sudden appearance had stirred within me.
Yes, I'm here about the car. You're Mike?
That's me.
He replied, extending a hand, which I shook tentatively. His grip was firm, but there was something in his touch that sent a shiver down my spine.
Sorry about the remote location. I prefer the peace and quiet out here.
I glanced around, noting the eerie stillness that enveloped us.
It's quite a drive.
Mike smiled, a gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes.
Let's go see the car. It's just this way.
He led me through the clearing and into the woods, following a narrow, overgrown path that twisted between the trees. The forest closed in around us, the canopy overhead so thick that it felt like twilight beneath the leaves. I followed Mike closely, my senses heightened. Every rustle in the underbrush, every creak of a tree branch, amplifying the growing sense of dread within me. After several minutes of walking, the trees began to thin, and we emerged into a small open area where an old dilapidated house stood. Its windows were boarded up, the paint peeling from its weathered siding. The place looked long abandoned, forgotten by time and the world outside. I stopped, my gaze taking in the scene before me. There was no sign of a car, no Toyota Camry waiting to be inspected, just this desolate house that seemed more a relic than a residence.
Where's the car?
I asked, turning to Mike. He gestured towards a rusty barn that stood off to the side of the house, its doors hanging askew on their hinges.
It's in there. I keep it covered up to protect it from the elements.
Something about his explanation didn't sit right with me, but curiosity and the nagging feeling of having been duped drove me forward. I followed him to the barn, the gravel crunching under our feet, the silence around us so thick it was almost tangible. As Mike slid the barn doors open, a musty, stale air wafted out, the scent of decay and neglect. The interior of the barn was dim, the only light filtering in through the cracks in the wooden walls. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but as they did, I realized that there was no car inside. Instead, the barn was cluttered with various items, old furniture, boxes, and tools, all coated in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. I turned to Mike, my confusion turning to anger.
Where's the Camry? What is this?
He stood at the entrance, blocking the only way out, his expression unreadable in the dim light.
I'm sorry. I needed to get you here, and the car seemed like a sure way.
My heart raced, fear and betrayal swirling in my mind.
Why? What do you want?
Before he could answer, my attention was drawn to something in the corner of the barn, something that stood out amidst the clutter. It was a figure, human-sized, covered with a tarp. As I stepped closer, driven by a morbid curiosity, Mike's voice broke the silence.
Don't!
He said, a note of warning in his voice. Ignoring him, I reached out and pulled the tarp away, revealing what lay beneath. It was a taxidermied human being, lifelike in its appearance, its eyes staring blankly ahead. I stumbled back, a gasp escaping my lips, my mind reeling from the grotesque sight.
What is this?
I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. Mike didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his presence filling the barn with an ominous air. I looked around frantically, realizing that the only exit was blocked by him and that I was trapped in this nightmarish place with a man I didn't know and couldn't trust. The tension in the barn was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed down on me, suffocating and inescapable. I was acutely aware of my isolation, of the fact that nobody knew where I was, that I had walked into this situation blindly and now found myself in a predicament that was rapidly spiraling out of control. As I stood there, facing the unknown and the unnerving reality of my situation, a cold realization settled over me. This was no simple scam, no mere deception. I was in real danger, far from help, far from the safety of the familiar. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone, the unmistakable click of a lock as Mike slid the barn door closed, plunging us into darkness. The darkness in the barn was absolute, a suffocating cloak that seemed to amplify every sound, every breath. My eyes, useless in the pitch black, strained for any hint of light, but there was none. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay and the chilling presence of the taxidermied human being I had just uncovered. Panic clawed at my chest, a wild, frantic thing that threatened to overwhelm me. Mike's silhouette loomed in the doorway, a darker shape against the faint light from outside. My mind raced, thoughts tumbling over each other in desperation. This wasn't just a scam, a simple trick to lure a gullible buyer. This was something far more sinister.
Mike, what is this?
My voice sounded small, almost childlike in my own ears.
Why have you brought me here?
He didn't answer, but I heard him move, a soft shuffling sound in the darkness. I backed away instinctively, my hands outstretched, feeling for obstacles in the cluttered space. The taxidermied figure was somewhere behind me, a silent, eerie sentinel in the gloom.
Please,
I continued, my voice trembling.
just let me go. I won't tell anyone about this, I swear.
Still, Mike said nothing. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, and the pounding of my heart in my ears. Fear, raw and primal, had taken hold, and with it came the realization of my vulnerability, of how easily one could disappear in a place like this. I stumbled over something on the floor, nearly falling. My hands found the rough surface of a table, old and laden with tools that clinked softly as I disturbed them. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a wrench, heavy and solid. Without thinking, I grasped it, the weight of it both comforting and terrifying. It was a weapon, a means of defense, but it also cemented the reality of my situation. In the darkness, I could sense Mike moving closer, his presence a tangible force. I held my breath, listening, trying to gauge his position. The barn felt like a maze, a trap designed to disorient and confuse.
Mike, let's talk about this. There's no need for anything to happen here.
There was a moment of silence, and then his voice, chilling in its calmness.
You shouldn't have come here. Nobody should have.
His words sent a shiver down my spine. They were an admission, a glimpse into the mind of someone who had stepped beyond the bounds of normalcy. The air between us was charged with unspoken threats, with the unsaid understanding that this was a game of survival now. The barn creaked around us, the old wood groaning as if in response to the unfolding drama. I tightened my grip on the wrench, my entire body tense, waiting for the slightest sound, the smallest movement that would signal an attack. And then it came. A sudden rush of movement, a blur in the darkness. I swung the wrench wildly, a scream tearing from my throat, more in fear than aggression. There was a thud, the sound of metal meeting flesh, and then a grunt of pain. I didn't wait to see if I had hurt him. I turned and ran, blindly, desperately, through the darkness. I could hear Mike behind me, his footsteps heavy and uneven, but I pushed myself harder, driven by sheer terror. My shoulder slammed into the barn door, pain shooting through my arm, but I didn't stop. I fumbled for the lock, my fingers clumsy with fear. Finally, I found it, sliding it open with a cry of relief. I burst out of the barn into the fading light, the evening air cool and sharp in my lungs. I didn't look back, didn't pause to see if Mike was following. I ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. The trees of the forest loomed around me, their branches reaching out like the arms of ghosts. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get away, to escape the nightmare that had ensnared me. Branches scratched at my face, roots tripped me up, but I kept moving, driven by an instinctive need to survive. The sounds of the forest were all around me, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the soft whisper of the wind. But to me, they were the sounds of pursuit, of danger lurking in every shadow. I had no idea how long I ran, time seeming to stretch and distort in my state of panic. The light was fading fast, the forest growing darker with each passing minute. I knew I couldn't keep running forever, that I needed to find help, but in the vastness of the woods, I felt hopelessly lost. Finally, my legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I lay there, the cold earth beneath me, the sky above just a narrow strip of dimming light between the treetops. I was alone, lost, and terrified, with no idea of what to do next. The wrench, my only weapon, lay beside me, a cold reminder of the violence I had been forced to commit. As the darkness closed in, the events in the barn replayed in my mind, a loop of horror and disbelief. The taxidermied human being, Mike's intentions, the struggle. It all seemed like a twisted nightmare, yet it was a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. In that moment, lying on the forest floor, I realized the true nature of the danger I had walked into. It wasn't just about being scammed or tricked. It was about survival, about the thin line between life and death that I had unwittingly crossed. And as the night enveloped me, I knew that the struggle was far from over, that the darkness held more than just the absence of light. It held secrets, dangers, and the chilling realization that my ordeal was only just beginning. Lying there in the underbrush, the forest's nocturnal chorus rising around me, I was consumed by an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. The wrench lay beside me, a cold, metallic testament to the violence I had never imagined myself capable of. Every shadow seemed to move with malevolent intent, every rustle of leaves a whisper of danger. I was no longer just lost in the woods. I was being hunted, or so my heightened senses led me to believe. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the initial surge of adrenaline that had fueled my flight began to wane, leaving me shivering and alert to every sound. The darkness was no longer just a physical barrier, but a psychological one, pressing in on me with the weight of all my fears and insecurities. The rustling of the leaves, previously a benign sound, now carried an ominous note. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, watching me with unseen eyes. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, just small animals scuttling through the undergrowth, but the fear that had lodged itself in my chest was a living thing, feeding on every creak and whisper of the night. Then I saw it. A faint light, not more than a flicker, between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. Was it Mike, with a flashlight searching for me? Or was it something else, perhaps another wanderer in the woods? The light moved erratically, weaving through the trees, now visible, now hidden. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small and inconspicuous as possible, the wrench gripped tightly in my hand. The light approached, and with it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching softly on the forest floor. I could barely see the figure behind the light, but there was no mistaking the intention in its movement. Someone was searching for me, methodically, patiently. Panic set in, raw and unthinking. I scrambled to my feet, my only thought to get away from the light, away from the person who wielded it. I ran blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, roots tripping me up. I fell, got up, and kept running, driven by the primal urge to escape. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of trees and shadows, each turn leading me deeper into its heart. The light behind me grew fainter, but I didn't dare slow down. The fear of being caught was like a fire in my veins, propelling me forward even as my body screamed for rest. Suddenly, I stumbled into a clearing, the moonlight a pale beacon in the darkness. I paused, gasping for breath, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of pursuit. The forest around me was silent, the light and the footsteps gone, as if they had never been. I listened, my heart pounding in my ears, but there was nothing, just the wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. The sense of being watched, however, did not abate. It was as if the forest itself had eyes, as if the trees were whispering secrets about me, secrets that I couldn't hear. The isolation, the fear, the relentless pursuit. It was all becoming too much. My mind, pushed to the brink, began to fracture, paranoia seeping into the cracks. I thought about Mike, about the barn and the taxidermied human being. Were there others like him out here, hidden in the forest, watching and waiting? Or was it just one man's twisted game, a game in which I had become an unwitting player? I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay in the open, exposed and vulnerable. I stepped back into the cover of the trees, my movements cautious, my senses on high alert. The darkness had become my enemy and my ally, concealing me even as it concealed those who might be stalking me. As I moved through the forest, the events of the evening replayed in my mind, a nightmarish loop that offered no answers, only more questions. What was the purpose of the taxidermied figure? Was it a warning, a sign of some macabre hobby, or something far more sinister? And the barn? Why had it been set up like a trap, luring me into its depths with the promise of a car that never existed? I shook my head, trying to clear it of the fog of fear and confusion. I needed to focus, to find a way out of the woods and back to safety. But every step seemed to take me deeper into the heart of the forest, further away from the world I knew. The night wore on, the moon tracing its slow path across the sky. I walked without direction, without purpose, driven only by the need to keep moving. The forest was a maze, its paths leading nowhere, its secrets hidden in the shadows. And all the while, I felt the presence of the watcher, unseen, but always there, just beyond the reach of my senses. It was a presence that filled me with dread, a reminder that I was not alone in this dark, wild place. The line between reality and imagination blurred, the forest becoming a landscape of my own fears. Every broken branch, every rustle of leaves was a sign of pursuit, a hint of danger lurking just out of sight. I was no longer just lost. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. As dawn approached, the first light of morning filtering through the trees, I found myself standing at the edge of a small pond, its surface still and undisturbed. The beauty of the scene, the tranquility of the water, stood in stark contrast to the turmoil within me. I looked at my reflection in the pond, a haggard, haunted figure barely recognizable as myself. The night had taken its toll, leaving me exhausted, both physically and mentally. But more than that, it had changed me, stripping away the veneer of normalcy and exposing the raw, primal core beneath. The Watcher, whoever or whatever it was, had not revealed itself, but its presence was a constant companion, a shadow that loomed over me, driving me to the edge of insanity. I was no longer just a victim of circumstance. I was a survivor, fighting against unseen forces in a battle that seemed to have no end. As the light grew stronger, dispelling the shadows and revealing the world in all its morning glory, I knew that the ordeal was far from over. The forest, with its secrets and its dangers, was still around me, and the Watcher, ever vigilant, was still out there, somewhere in the depths of the trees. But for now, I was alive, and in the light of the new day, that was all that mattered. I had survived the night, and with the dawn came a new resolve, a determination to face whatever lay ahead, to find my way back to the world I had left behind. As the first rays of dawn pierced the dense canopy, casting a soft golden light on the forest floor, I knew I couldn't afford to waste a moment. The eerie calm of the morning belied the terror of the night, and with each passing minute, my resolve hardened. I had to escape this suffocating wilderness and the unseen Watcher whose presence haunted my every step. With a deep breath, I set off, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The forest, though less menacing in the light of day, was still a labyrinth of shadows and unknown dangers. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves underfoot seemed to echo unnaturally, as if the forest itself was alert to my escape. I tried to retrace my steps, to find my way back to the clearing where the nightmare had begun. But the woods were disorienting, the landmarks I remembered from my frantic flight now elusive. The sense of being watched, of being followed, persisted, a constant prickle at the back of my neck. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye, a shadow darting between the trees. I froze, my heart pounding, straining my eyes to see through the dense foliage. There it was again, a fleeting glimpse of something or someone moving parallel to me. Paranoia gripped me, the line between reality and fear blurring. I changed direction, veering off the path I thought I had been following, plunging deeper into the underbrush. Brambles and thorns scratched at my skin, but I pushed through, driven by the primal urge to flee. The sounds of pursuit seemed to grow closer, footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves, but unmistakable in their intent. The terrain became more rugged, the ground sloping steeply downward. I stumbled, losing my footing, and slid down the embankment, my hands grasping at anything to slow my descent. I landed hard at the bottom, the air knocked from my lungs, my head spinning. For a moment, I lay there, dazed, the world a blur of green and brown. Then, the rustling of leaves nearby jolted me back to reality. Scrambling to my feet, I glanced around, trying to orient myself. To my right, the sound of a stream reached my ears, its gurgle a beacon of hope. Water meant a path, a way out. Limping, I made my way towards the sound, the underbrush thick and unyielding. The stream, when I finally reached it, was a narrow ribbon of water cutting through the forest. I followed it, my progress slow but steady, the water a guide leading me onward. The forest seemed to wake up around me, the sounds of birds and small animals filling the air. But underneath the natural chorus, there was something else, a subtle, unnatural noise that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, of being hunted. The stream led me to a larger river, its banks muddy and overgrown. I paused, scanning the area for any sign of the Watcher, any indication that I wasn't alone. But there was nothing, just the gentle flow of the water and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I turned to follow the river, hoping it would lead me to civilization, to safety. But as I moved along the bank, a sense of unease grew within me. The feeling of being watched was stronger here, more oppressive. Then, without warning, a figure stepped out from behind a tree, blocking my path. It was Mike, his face twisted in a grimace of pain and anger. Blood seeped from a wound on his head, a souvenir from our encounter in the barn. I stopped dead in my tracks, the wrench still in my hand, a feeble defense against the threat in front of me. Mike's eyes were cold, his intent clear.
You shouldn't have run,
he said, his voice low and menacing. I weighed my options, my mind racing. Fighting was a last resort. Escape was the only real choice. I moved to the left, then bolted to the right, hoping to slip past him. But Mike was quicker than I expected, his hand lashing out to grab my arm. A struggle ensued, a desperate tussle on the muddy bank. Mike was strong, but the injury to his head had slowed him, and I fought with the ferocity of someone whose life depended on it, because it did. We fell to the ground, rolling in the mud, each trying to gain the upper hand. I managed to free my arm and swung the wrench with all my might. It connected with a sickening thud, and Mike's grip loosened. Seizing the moment, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I could hear Mike behind me, his footsteps heavy and labored, but I didn't look back. I ran with a single-minded focus, the river my guide, my path to freedom. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the river winding its way through the endless trees. But I didn't stop, didn't dare slow down. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but I couldn't be sure if Mike had given up, or if he was still following, biding his time. Time lost its meaning as I ran, the sun climbing higher in the sky, then beginning its slow descent. My body ached, my throat was parched, but fear was a powerful motivator, pushing me beyond my physical limits. And then, finally, salvation. The sound of a road, the distant hum of traffic. I emerged from the trees onto a small road, the sight of civilization bringing tears to my eyes. I had made it, escaped the nightmare that had enveloped me in the depths of the forest. I stumbled along the road, my steps unsteady, my mind still reeling from the ordeal. A car passed, then another, and finally, one stopped. The driver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked if I was okay. I could barely speak, my voice a hoarse whisper, but I managed to convey the basics. I was lost. I needed help. She offered to drive me to the nearest town, and I accepted gratefully, the relief of being safe, of being seen and heard, overwhelming. As we drove away from the forest, the trees receding in the rearview mirror, I realized that this was more than just a physical escape. It was a liberation from the fear and paranoia that had gripped me, a release from the oppressive presence of the Watcher. But even as relief washed over me, a part of me knew that the experience would stay with me, a shadow in my mind, a reminder of the darkness that lurked in the heart of the forest and in the heart of man. The ride back to town was a blur, a disjointed journey through a landscape that seemed both familiar and alien. The woman who had given me a ride, Mrs. Parker, glanced at me occasionally with a mix of concern and curiosity, but she asked no questions, for which I was grateful. I wasn't sure I could have answered them even if I wanted to. Upon reaching the town, Mrs. Parker dropped me off at the local police station. I thanked her with a hoarse whisper, my voice still raw from the terror of the night. She gave me a reassuring nod and drove away, leaving me to face the aftermath of my ordeal. The police station, with its sterile walls and fluorescent lights, felt like a sanctuary after the dark, oppressive forest. I relayed my story to the officers, my words a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. They listened with a skepticism that turned to concern as the details of my tale unfolded. The Craigslist ad, the remote property, the taxidermied human, and Mike's sinister intentions. I could see the disbelief in their eyes, the incredulity at the bizarre and horrifying nature of my account. Yet, there was enough conviction in my voice, enough raw fear, to convince them to investigate. A team was dispatched to the location I described, their mission to verify my story and apprehend Mike. I waited in the station, a cup of coffee in my shaking hands, the events of the past hours replaying in my mind like a nightmare from which I could not awaken. Hours passed, and finally the officers returned, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. The property was, as I had described, a desolate plot of land with an old, dilapidated house and a barn. But there was no sign of Mike, no trace of the taxidermied human being, and no evidence that anyone had been there recently. The officers searched the area thoroughly, but it was as if the earth had swallowed Mike whole. The house and barn were empty, abandoned long ago by all appearances. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing to suggest that the harrowing events I had described had taken place there. I sat in the police station, the weight of their skepticism bearing down on me. Had I imagined it all? The fear, the chase, the feeling of being hunted, were they just the creations of a mind pushed to the brink of sanity? But no, the memories were too vivid, too visceral to be mere figments of my imagination. The wrench I had used to defend myself, still in the police's possession, was real enough. Yet, without evidence, my story was just that, a story, unbelievable and fantastical. The police promised to keep the investigation open, to look into Mike's identity, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I was released from the station, a victim of an unexplained incident, a survivor of an ordeal that had no proof, no validation. The town, when I walked its familiar streets, seemed different now. The faces of passers-by, once friendly and open, now appeared secretive, their eyes holding untold stories. The shadows cast by the buildings, the alleys and doorways, seemed darker, more ominous. I found myself looking over my shoulder, jumping at sudden movements, the trauma of my experience a constant companion. The world felt less safe, less predictable. The shadows within everyday encounters seemed deeper, hiding unknown dangers and deceptions. The days that followed were a struggle, a battle to return to normalcy. But how could I, when normalcy had been so irrevocably shattered? The Craigslist ad, a simple online transaction, had led me to the brink of death and back. The internet, a tool I had used without a second thought, now seemed a gateway to hidden horrors. I kept to myself, my interactions with others brief and superficial. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being a part of some game that I neither understood nor wanted to play. The forest, with its dark secrets, seemed to encroach upon the edges of my reality, a reminder of the unknown that lurked just out of sight. And Mike, the enigmatic figure at the center of it all, remained a mystery. Had he been real, or just a manifestation of my deepest fears? The police found no records of him, no evidence that he had ever existed. He was a ghost, a shadow that had entered my life and left no trace behind. As I tried to rebuild my life, to find some semblance of peace, I couldn't help but wonder about the others like Mike, lurking in the shadows of the digital world, waiting to ensnare the unwary. The internet, a vast, unregulated expanse, was a breeding ground for deception and danger. The experience had changed me, altered my perception of the world and the people in it. Trust, once given freely, was now a commodity I could ill afford. The shadows, once benign, now held a menace that I could not ignore. And so, I moved through life with a newfound caution, a wariness of the unseen and the unknown. The world was a darker place, but I was a survivor, tempered by the fires of my ordeal. In the end, the mystery of that night remained unsolved, a question mark hanging over my existence. But perhaps some mysteries are better left unanswered, some shadows better left unexplored. For in the heart of every shadow, there lies a story that is often better left untold.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Quantum Dispatches and stay tuned next week for another thrilling adventure. Thank you for listening.